I'm John Levine. Welcome to the Berkeley Writers at Work 30th Anniversary audio series. Berkeley Writers at Work launched in 1997 as a forum for campus writers to discuss their writing process. Since then, we have interviewed dozens of faculty writers from the departments of history, psychology, public policy, ethnic studies, and mathematics, just to name a few, to talk about how, where, and when they write. In celebration of UC Berkeley's college writing program's 30th anniversary, we are looking inward, turning the microphone towards our own writers, the vastly talented CWP lecturers, many of whom are successful writers in their own right. For more information about Berkeley Writers at Work, be sure to visit our website at writing.berkeley.edu. In this episode, college writing program's lecturers Bridgette Portman and Michal Reznizki read from their works. One is a young adult novel, and the other is a collection of essays about teaching first-year college composition. And then they talk about their writing processes, how they approach different writing genres, and how being parents has affected their lives as writers and as writing teachers.
Hello, thank you for joining us. So this is a conversation between Bridgette Portman and myself, Michal Reznizki. Bridgette just published the book, The Word of the Muse, a YA space fantasy, a thrilling conclusion to the Cosima saga trilogy.
And Michal just published the edited collection, Dynamic Activities for First-Year Composition, with her co-editor, David Code.
All right, so I'm going to start by reading the first part of the introduction to the book, Dynamic Activities for First-Year Composition. The book is a collection of activities for writing instructors to do in the classroom. Why dynamic activities? This book is a unique and exciting contribution to the field of composition studies because it includes hands-on and practical activities for the composition classroom that teachers, both new and experienced, can put into practice right away. It addresses many elements that are at the core of teaching first-year composition: genre, rhetoric, reading strategies, argument, and revision, to name a few. It approaches these topics by providing dozens of successful and accessible exercises and activities that writing instructors from all over the country have been using in the classroom. What is so unique and amazing about this book is that it gives concrete attention to pedagogical practice, expanding on existing material such as BIN, the Sweetland Digital Rhetoric Collaborative, Activities and Assignments Archive by Writing Spaces, Cohen, and many others. By focusing on and emphasizing pedagogical practices, it strengthens and brings to the forefront the practical in the teaching of writing. Who hasn't spent hours thinking about and trying to plan classroom activities that will be helpful for students to learn and engage with specific concepts? A big part of being a teacher, and especially a writing instructor, means spending hours on lesson planning in a class where most of the time is spent discussing readings or ideas in groups. Many of us chat with various colleagues in person and online, seeking insights into their classroom activities. The lengths we go to find and develop quality activities for our classrooms are immense. As two writing instructors who have been teaching in the field for more than a decade, we have had similar experiences and have been looking for a book like this one for a while. This book cuts to the chase. It includes practical and engaging activities and saves you the time of coming up with and planning new activities. For writing instructors who don't have time to read pedagogical articles or other discourse-heavy resources and then convert them into practice, this book is the practical application with all the steps right up front. It allows instructors to see what their colleagues are doing. Dozens of proven successful activities are at your fingerprints. First-year composition is a course that requires constant, high-level creative thinking from instructors about how to engage students in active learning. That is because many first-year composition courses are discussion-based and many become monotonous for the students and the instructor when the same activities are used over and over again. In turn, this repetition makes the learning process boring and less effective. First-year composition courses are very different from other general education courses and introductory courses in the major. That is, first-year composition courses are more intense to teach because the main goal of these courses is, in most cases, to have students practice and learn the skill of writing, in addition to acquiring knowledge about ideas and theories in the field. While some instructors are teaching writing concepts and theories, such as the writing about writing and teaching for transfer approaches, those instructors still need to expose students to an abundance of activities in which they have the opportunity to practice that skill. Therefore, this book offers an active learning approach that makes the composition classroom activities more engaging, lively, and diverse, activities that enhance student engagement and learning. In addition to this book being practical and user-friendly for any writing instructor, it is also an indispensable resource for both new and experienced teachers of writing. On the one hand, it is useful for new teachers and can be used as a textbook to help graduate students who are learning to teach writing develop activities for their future classrooms. On the other hand, it also helps more experienced writing instructors reflect on their classroom practices. It offers ways to revise current approaches to teaching writing and provides ideas that they have likely never thought of before.
Thank you for reading that, Michal. I can't wait to discuss this book with you. I know I find it extremely useful. I am going to now read a section from the first book of my young adult fantasy trilogy, which is called The Twin Stars. One thing that I really liked about writing this was being able to make up fantastic worlds. I also have some mental health themes in this book, so I think this excerpt kind of shows both. The hallway turned left ahead of her and became a flight of stairs. She took them two at a time as she fled upward, the staircase spiraling in a dizzying coil. Her bare feet echoed against the stone walls. She was only distantly aware of her aching knee. At last she saw light, and suddenly she was out of the stairwell and standing outside. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the brightness, and then she realized that she was on the roof of the sanctuary. She was not, however, entirely outdoors. A semi-transparent shield covered the roof like a bubble, tempering the blazing light of the two stars. Peering around at what the great shield protected, Olive felt a surge of déjà vu. She had never, of course, been here, and yet she knew this place as intimately as a recurring dream. She had written it. This was the Gem Garden. Olive had bought her friend Lori a crystal growing kit for her 12th birthday, and they had been enchanted by the multicolored minerals that blossomed out of it. That kit had inspired what Olive now saw before her. Clusters of white pearls ripened like grapes under hanging arbors. Frosted crystals of every color thrust spires into the air like the arms of cactuses, some of them reaching higher than Olive's head. She saw great boulders of salty pink quartz, so perfectly geometrical that she wondered if someone had carved them and shaped them like topiaries. Feathery green and blue minerals grew in moss-like clusters, beside bristling reefs of coral-colored gems, planters filled with deep red rubies, beds of glittering black onyx. It was so beautiful that Olive felt goosebumps prickle her arms under the draping sleeves of her robe. She remembered inventing the gem garden, but she had never set down in words the vivid detail she saw now. Something had filled in the gaps between her words, like an artist fleshing out the contours of a drawing. Another feeling crept into Olive then, one that was all too familiar and frustrating, the overwhelming urge to wash her hands. She had touched many surfaces, countless walls and doors and knobs, since fleeing into the sanctuary. In her own world, she would have found a sink and scrubbed her hands raw by now, blaming her chapped skin on the dry weather if anyone asked. At school, other students teased Olive about her hand-washing compulsion, and even Lori had called her a germaphobe. The habit exasperated her mother, and her father usually laughed it off as a quirk. She could not have explained to them the terrifying fear she had of contracting a deadly disease and passing it along to other people. Sometimes, if she concentrated hard enough, she could resist washing her hands for hours at a time. Eventually, though, she would give in to the tyrant in her head, and the relentless anxiety would finally go away. until she touched something else. There was nowhere and no time to wash her hands now. Her left hand clenched and unclenched, and she wiped it on her robe, although she knew the fabric was just as dirty as anything she had touched. Her right hand still clutched the journal so tightly that her knuckles stood out in bony peaks.
Thank you so much. So I want to start by asking you more about your writing process. So how do you begin the writing process? How do you start writing? Do you just come up with ideas and write them down? Do you take notes? What is your process when you start writing?
I first kind of try to come up with a premise. And in the case of this trilogy, it was the idea of what if somebody fell into a world that they had created themselves, that they had written themselves. And then from there, I tried to come up with the characters. And then I usually outline. I call myself a plantser rather than a plotter or a pantser, as in flying by the seat of your pants. So I make a loose outline and try to come up with, okay, basically what's going to happen in each chapter and kind of like what's the overall arc of the characters. And at that point, I kind of fill things in and then I start going. And then I change the outline as I'm writing. Sometimes I add new characters. Sometimes I realize something that I thought was going to work does not work, or there's a plot hole that I need to fill in. And then I go back. But overall, having that loose outline is what helps me stay on track. And so that's my general process with getting started. And for you, I'm curious, I think you touched on this a little bit when you read your introduction, but what was it that made you decide to write and edit this book? You said that you would wish that you had a book like this, but what kind of gave you that impetus to say, okay, I'm going to do this?
It came out of a struggle that I had with teaching. I always felt like I was a good teacher, but at the end of my first year at UC Berkeley, I felt like I was struggling with the class. So I think the main thing is I was doing my best, but I felt like my class was very repetitive. I was doing the same things all the time. And for that, the R1A, the intensive writing class, which is 3 times a week for 2 hours. And then I got the students' feedback, and one of the students said something like, the class is boring, like we do the same thing all the time. And so that summer, after reading these feedback, I, met with a good friend of mine, David Code, who I ended up writing this book with. And, I just told him, do you have a resource? Do you know of any resources or book or anything where I can find activities to do in the classroom? Because this is something I'm really struggling with. And then both of us started looking for such a resource and we couldn't find any. And I just came up with the idea. I said, let's just do it ourselves. So it really came from a struggle that I had. I feel like at the beginning, we were trying to actually write the activities, which was very difficult because just for 2 people to come up with so many activities is really hard. So after talking to several people and consulting with people, we decided to just create an edited collection where we collect activities from people all around the US who teach writing and have such great ideas.
That is so cool. As a first-year writing teacher, this book, I was so excited when I heard that it was coming out because I've struggled to come up with activities and worried that the activities that I've come up with maybe haven't worked well or have been boring, and which is why I bought a copy of this, and I've already used one of the activities from it. So I'm so grateful. I know a lot of writing instructors are.
Cool. I want to go back a little bit to your writing process that you mentioned earlier. We talked more about how do you begin the process. I feel like for me, for example, when I need to write something, I have to write it down on paper first. So once I have something on paper, I go back to my computer and start typing and editing and doing all that. So I'm just wondering, in terms of, again, you're writing fiction, do you have some kind of a structure process? Do you have notes that you take? Do you do it on your computer? Do you do it on a hard copy? I'm interested to know more about your process, especially with the note taking and...
Yeah, I do most everything on my computer. Sometimes when I'm first coming up with characters or plot, I like to use paper so that I can kind of draw like arrows and sketch, and it's just more free. And so I do have papers like that that are full of notes of very kind of the beginning process. And then once I'm pretty clear on the characters, I do go on my computer. I use Word. I always use Word. I know some people there's various software that's for writing novels and plays. And like I've tried it and I just like Word. So I'll make like little character bios. So I'll have like a file with outlines. I'll have a file with character biographies and backstories. Then I actually sometimes use Excel to make a detailed outline, like chapter by chapter outline. But like I said before, that outline sometimes changes. So it's very flexible.
Before we move on, I have another follow-up question. This is something that I feel like recently I've been not struggling with, but thinking more about. Like for me, when I'm working on, writing something, suddenly I have an idea, but I'm in the middle of something else. And I in the past, I would always say, okay, I'll remember to do it later. And then when I get to my computer, I forget. And so I started just taking some notes on my phone, just on the Notes app. So like, let's say I'm taking a shower and I have this great idea for something. I get out of the shower and I just write something down right away so that I will remember it.
That's such a good idea.
I'm just wondering if you have, like, if you think about an idea when, again, you're not focusing on writing, do you have any system or anything?
I've actually used that notes feature on my phone too. And I've actually used it in my car while driving. If I want to work on something, I'll either record ideas while driving. I can't type it while driving, but I'll record it like into the notes on my phone and then look at it later. And usually like it's almost illegible, but yeah, that's a really good way to not lose those ideas that come up sometimes inconveniently.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, so you collaborated with a co-editor and then you also had all of these contributors to your book. So what was that process of collaboration like?
So first, I feel like that collaboration was amazing. First, I was working with someone that I've known for many years. Both David and I, we did our masters at San Jose State. This is where we first met. And then both of us went to UC Davis for the PhD in education. So we've known each other for a long time, and we would always meet over the summer just to talk about teaching. I feel like the collaboration was so much fun because we get along really, really well. And I feel like it was more a process of supporting each other. So every time there was, when you're working by yourself, you're emailing the editor and you get, something that is upsetting, or you have someone to talk to. And that was very helpful in that regard. In terms of the editing and choosing the activities, when we just started, we felt like our purpose is to include as many activities as possible. So the peer review wasn't like, let's see what is good and what is bad, but just we had specific standards that we wanted the activities to follow, but we were really trying to include all the activities. So once we got all the activities, we went over them together. And then if we saw something that we didn't like, we would say, okay, let's see, we would send the person saying, we like the activity, but it has to be revised. So many activities went through that revision process as well. But again, the purpose was to include as many activities as possible.
I see.
I want to go back to asking you, for me, this is the first book that I published. And again, it's an edited collection. It's more of an academic, the genre is academic. And I feel like for me, for a very long time, I was struggling with that perception of seeing myself as an author or a writer. Again, I've been in the field of composition studies, I've been teaching, so I see myself more of as a scholar and a teacher. So I wanted to ask you, when did you come to see yourself as a writer? Was it directly related to, the books that you've published? Did it start before?
That's a really good question. I have had imposter syndrome for a really long time, so I completely understand with this idea of like not wanting to call myself writer. And I think a lot of writers struggle with that because we have this perception that like, unless we're famous or something, we're not real writers. And so I would say like, the answer is that I still struggle with that. And I don't know if I'll ever get to a point, but I guess I just remind myself that like, anybody who writes and gets their work out there is a writer. Publishing this series helped. I'm a playwright as well, and I've had a number of plays produced. So I guess it's just a matter of kind of finding that confidence in yourself and saying, hey, like, this is what a writer is. You've reached the point already. And for you, you are, 100% a writer.
Yeah, I feel like just having that actual book to hold and see my name on it.
It makes it more real, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's always a great feeling when you get to hold that physical copy of the book for the first time.
Another thing that I wanted to ask you, again, I really like that contrast between the two genres of our books. I just wanted to address that academic genre versus fiction writing. So I've never written fiction before, but I feel like writing fiction has a slightly different process than writing for academic purposes. So do you agree, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's different structurally. With fiction, I have to think about, things like characterization. When I think about structure, I think about the plot and the plot arc. So, what is the inciting incident, rising action, the climax? Sometimes I think in terms of like a 3-act structure. And when I'm thinking about academic writing, it's very different. I think about, what's the thesis? What is the development of ideas here? Because with academic writing, you're essentially like, you're presenting an argument rather than telling a story. But I think there is overlap as well. I mean, when you're writing something academically, you're also telling a story. Do you agree?
Yeah, I feel like for me, again, and I haven't published any fiction, but I feel like, again, in terms of the work on this book, I feel like I always had like a specific task in mind. Okay, so now I need to write the introduction. Now I need to do this. Now it's the editing process. And I feel like, and again, this is back to you, but when you write fiction, like just hearing you read that, I kept thinking, wow, how did you come up with all that? And I feel like you need some kind of be very imaginative, have this muse or something that is more connected to imagination. And I feel like that is, you do need imagination and creativity, but I feel like it's more, at least with the final product.
Yeah, it's probably sort of like a spectrum, right? Because you have to have imagination to come up with like the activities that are in your book. Maybe more of the imagination is needed for fiction, but in terms of like structure and process, I feel like it's similar. You still have to do outlining and pre-writing and structuring and revision and drafts. I think sometimes there's like a misconception that, a muse just kind of beams ideas straight into an author's head and then they just like go and write and it all comes out perfectly. And I think that rarely happens. I don't think that's ever happened to me. It's all been like very structured.
And again, just something that I kept thinking about when you were talking is also, the audience, because I feel like, for academic writing, sometimes the audience is students, sometimes other scholars. So it's, again, different genre, different audience. When you write fiction, I guess, how do you think about your audience? And
like for my trilogy, it's young adults. So I'm thinking ages like 12 to 16. And so that's reflected probably in some of the vocabulary. But on the other hand, I think some of the themes that I write about are, adult level themes as well. So yeah, I think it's a different audience, and that is, as I said, probably reflected in vocabulary, but there's a lot of overlap too, just in terms of structure.
Interesting.
I'd like to ask, when you think about your writing process and your process for, creating this book, is it similar to what you teach students?
I would say yes, definitely. When I teach, I always emphasize that each student, each writer, each person has a different writing process because it's so personalized and it's an individual decision. But I always encourage students to think about that process. And I usually try to talk to them about my own process just to think about how to do it. And I always say that I start with, a pen and paper and just jot down idea. And this is also something that I do in the classroom. So before we have an essay, I do free writing exercises and I bring paper and I bring pens and everybody has to sit down and write just to imitate that. And then once they have that kind of messy page with their handwriting, then we move on to the next stage of, typing it and thinking more about structure and what they're actually going to say. So I would say definitely yes. So I try both to talk about my process and also imitate that as part of the classroom. What about you? Do you also teach or talk about your own writing process?
I do. One of the things I stress to students is that your first draft doesn't have to be perfect, that it can actually be really bad and messy. And I tell them about how my first drafts are, which they're sometimes horrible and they're not fit for anyone's eyes but me. And then, so I try to emphasize that writing is a process, that it's never going to be the best when you first get it down. It's not that way for anybody, even very experienced writers. And so I have them also do free writing. I have them do outlines. I have them do first drafts. And I say, hey, your first draft can be quite bad. And then, we go through a revision process. And I tie that to, the revision process that I go through. So, yeah.
And for our last theme, I feel like, both of us are mothers to young kids. And I don't know, I always feel like that is, in a way, the background. So I wanted to ask you, have you published before having kids and also after? And if being a mother influenced or affected your writing or identity as a writer in any way?
That's a really interesting question. I published my novels after having kids. I did a little bit of kind of playwriting before. I feel like maybe it's, at least in the case of my novels, I feel in a way that I'm writing for them, even though my novels are young adults. So my oldest right now is 8, so he's not quite ready. But I dedicated my first novel to my kids. And so my hope is that when they get old enough, they can read it. And so I kind of have them in mind when I'm writing. And now my oldest is really interested. He wants to help. He wants to read them. He wants to help me come up with names. And he actually did help me come up with a name for one of my characters.
Nice.
And same question to you, because you have young kids as well.
Yeah, I feel like similarly, I feel like my kids always inspire me. So again, my work is more academic. So it's not written for my kids. It's more for writing instructors. But I feel like there are two aspects here. One is, in terms of my productivity, I feel like having that another aspect in my life actually has helped me become more productive. So in the past, before I had kids and I was in grad school, I always felt like I would waste so much time, or during the day I would just write one sentence and I would tell myself, what did I do all day? Now, because my alone time or the time that I have to work on, my work is sometimes limited, I feel like I'm much more productive when I sit down to write, when I sit down to work, because I know, okay, I only have this amount of time.
I agree with that. And that's one of the reasons why I sometimes try to write in the car. It's like squeeze every free moment. You need to use it.
And the other aspect is, my kids are so creative and imaginary. And sometimes, even though, the ideas are not directly related to what I'm doing, just being with them, sometimes just inspires me and makes me think about different things that I would probably never have thought of.
Yeah. Has raising kids influenced it all the way that you teach as well?
Yes, definitely. I think the main thing, again, and this is more about teaching, this is in recent years, I feel like I really put a lot of effort in connecting with my students. And I feel like because I do a lot of things to connect with my kids. And I feel like similarly, I try to do that with my students because it helps so much with teaching, with understanding the material and feeling confident and comfortable in the classroom.
Yeah, I think I feel similarly. Yeah. Are you working on any writing projects now, or do you have any plans for the future?
I'm currently not working on any project, mostly just things promoting the book.
Right.
What about you?
I'm promoting my books as well, but I do have plans to write another young adult novel, a sci-fi one set on Mars.
Amazing.
And so that's going to be my next project, I think.
Wow.
Well, it was really great to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for everyone who's tuned in to listen.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening to Berkeley Writers at Work audio series, a production of the college writing programs at UC Berkeley. You can find more information about our program at writing.berkeley.edu. I'm John Levine.